The Misfits.
Hey everybody, welcome back. We have had a lot of technical issues over the past month or so, but we're back. We're hoping this one is working. We are also hoping that the one that caused all the technical issues will be back and ready to go. Tamiko and I are going to try to re-record that for next week, but for now, Stefon Napier is back. He can't stay away. He contacted me, what was it, Wednesday or Thursday?
Pretty sure this is probably Wednesday.
Yeah. In the midst of all the, we'll just call it chaos to use polite words here. In the midst of all the chaos on Wednesday, he hit me up, said, hey, we need to talk about this. And so we are going to do our best to walk through a couple of different things today related to what happened on Tuesday and what's been happening since Tuesday. So for those that don't know, we are recording this on November 9th. Look at a calendar. You can probably do the math and figure out what happened on Tuesday. We are, we are looking at something that goes beyond just Tuesday in some cases, as well as hopefully we'll explain to some people what is going on. And then also, hopefully, provide some help for those that are in the midst of it right now. So, with that being said, we're going to try to break this up into like 3 or 4 parts and do this as easily and, I guess, trying to think of the right wording for this. As simply and as helpfully, I guess, as comfortably is probably the better word for it, as possible for everybody. So we're going to look at what lament is. We're going to look at why people do it in general, but especially why people are doing it at the moment. And then we're going to look at the actual ecclesiological applications of all this and what the church is supposed to be doing, what the church needs to be doing right now. And finally, we're going to be able to hopefully get into a little bit of what new monasticism is saying about everything, since that was what Stefon was originally supposed to come on and talk about like 6 months ago, and we never did it. So, we're going to try to hit all that up. We're going to try to do it as smoothly and as honestly and as empathetically, I guess that was actually the word I was looking for earlier, empathetically as possible. So, we'll start with this. Stefon, what does lament actually mean?
So, your textbook dictionary definition of lament is a passionate expression of grief or sorrow. You know, somebody has passed away. There is sorrow for that. You've experienced some kind of a loss in your life. You have an intense pattern of grief or sorrow.
Typically, when we talk about lament from a Christian perspective or a Jewish perspective, there's one more element that has to be added in. Because it's not just about the expression of sorrow. The expression of sorrow is done in a way that has meaning and provides benefit in the long run rather than destruction. And I think that's the first thing we want to make sure we are clear on, is that when we talk about lament, it is an act of worship, not just an act of mourning. When we look at the book of Lamentations, which is where typically we get the word lament out of when we're talking about it in especially Christian sections, because that seems to be the only place that we can somehow identify people lamenting in Scripture as Lamentations, even though we see it all throughout both Old and New Testament. We've got Jeremiah, who has just spent a life of ridicule and ministry, and in most cases, when you read it, depression. Now in a new season of his life where the temple has been destroyed, the walls have been destroyed, the city is destroyed, everybody's been exiled out, and he's left standing there. And so he writes this book of Lamentations where he is angry at the people. He's angry at God. But yet in the midst of all of it, we still see little tiny glimpses of the fact that Jeremiah still has his faith intact, even in the midst of being angry at everybody around him. Would you say that's pretty accurate summary?
Absolutely.
So the question then is, how are we supposed to do it now? This is, I don't remember if you said new monasticism deals with this specific thing or not, but I was curious if there's anything from a new monastic standpoint dealing with this area of lament. I know there is with some of the other things we're going to be getting to here later, but does new monasticism actually provide us with any tools, any thoughts behind what this actually looks like in today's world?
I don't know if it provides us with anything extra outside of scripture, but I would say that if I had to give maybe a new monastic depiction of like how lament works, is I know that one of the marks of a new monasticism, maybe not necessarily a mark, but coming alongside people in their sorrow is a really big thing. So whatever people are in sorrow or whatever they're lamenting, new monasticism kind of sees that and comes alongside them in solidarity. There it goes, suffering in solidarity. I was like, what? It's on the tip of my tongue, and I cannot quite remember it, but it would be what we refer to as suffering in solidarity. So, and I think that this situation is a great example of that, because there are so many people that are hurting in the wake of this past election. And there are people that have opened up their own churches. There are people that have opened up their own homes to create third spaces for people to come and deal with their grief.
Yeah, and so we're going to get into that part of it here in a second. For those that are trying to figure out what to do with this idea of lament in general, because they're wanting to do it, they just aren't sure how. One of the best ways that I have found to be able to practice this idea is we need to be willing to actually let ourselves actually feel, is the first part of this. And that's something that we're going to get into throughout today's episode, actually, because that falls into even what you were just talking about with the new monasticism and the solidarity and everything else, is this idea of, empathy and feeling are not necessarily welcome within the theology discussions that we typically see happening in the West today.
Yes.
But if we actually look at what Scripture says and look at how Scripture lays this kind of setting out, feeling, empathy are human attributes that God gave us for a reason. We even see God do this, at least describe himself as doing this throughout the prophets, of having, sadness, having anger, having frustration with the people or with the effects of sin on creation. And so we see God doing this, but yet when we try to do it, suddenly we don't want to be involved with those sort of things. And so the first thing we would say with all of this is that it's okay and it's actually healthy, and it's actually, in some cases, it's actually one of those areas where it's part of being an image bearer to let yourself actually do these things. Now, the next step in all of this is we need to address what it is that people actually are mourning and weeping and lamenting about, because this is something that I don't know if you've been getting the same messages I have, Stefon. We're getting some messages from people that are in the midst of the lament, in the midst of mourning, in the midst of weeping. And they're getting very frustrated with the people that are telling them it's not okay, or there's nothing to be weeping about. And then we're also getting messages from people that are telling us they don't understand why people are mourning and weeping and lamenting, because all it is it's showing they're sore losers. So we want to take a minute and actually address what it is that people are weeping over. Because if we don't understand that, we're not going to be able to do all these things that we're going to talk about as far as what the church's call is. Part of empathy is understanding where people are coming from. So we need to actually make sure we understand what it is that is going on. If you are one that is not in lament at the moment, we need to understand why people might be. So the first thing I understand is this is not people upset that their candidate lost. I think that's something that is hard for some people to grasp. It's not about their candidate losing. It's about which candidate won. And specifically, not even necessarily the candidate as much as the ideology of the candidate that won. Because this is what people are afraid of. This is what people are scared of. This is why people are in mourning. Is that the current president-elect got there through rhetoric that was racist, it was sexist, it was violent, it was literally built off of self-professed lies. The guy has been convicted of sexual abuse. The guy's proud of the abuse. Those sort of things can't go unnoticed, and they can't be ignored. It's going to cause people to fear. When Joe and I, those that want to go back and listen to it, when Joe and I did our episode on Project 2025, we talked about the fact that Trump had distanced himself from it, but it didn't really matter if he distances himself from it or not, because the stuff that is in that document was based out of rhetoric that had become normalized within society because of the man. In 2016, when we saw this, people didn't know really what to do with it, so they just kind of jumped on board. But in 2020, in the wake of him losing, we saw the results of that rhetoric that showed itself publicly in violence on January 6th. But more than that is what allowed for Christian nationalism to no longer have to hide itself and to become mainstream. And so beyond just the fear of the physical repercussions, there is also something where those of us that are believers should also be at least lamenting and mourning about what this is saying about the witness of the church in the midst of all of this. That is part of why people are weeping. They are weeping because of the fact that the rhetoric is targeting them. The rhetoric has produced violence towards them. I mean, Misfits has already gotten violent messages at us in the past, 72 hours because of the Project 2025 episode. We had a listener that messaged me saying that they shared one of our things, and somebody came back saying, well, those people are all mentally unstable in the midst of all of this. And all we are doing is just putting out resourcing. And most of us outside of Tamiko are straight white dudes. It's going to produce chaos in people's lives. Not because their candidate lost, but because of what the ideology is saying and what the ideology is going to produce. And we already are seeing examples of it. And so if you are not seeing examples of it, then either you're in a good spot in the country, so be glad you're in that spot in the country, or it means that maybe we need to open up our contacts a little bit more and start to talk to people that are hurting and ask why. With that being said, that's why people are weeping. So now we want to actually make sure we spend the rest of the time actually talking about what the church is supposed to do in the midst of all of this. And that is more so of what you actually were wanting to talk about when you messaged me. I was like, yeah, we are definitely talking about that, but we've got to make sure we hit these other areas first. Because before we can talk about what the church's response is, we need to talk about what we are responding to. And the first part of that is that lament is healthy. Lament is actually part of worship. The second part of that is we need to understand why people are weeping, why people are in lament. And so now, Stefon, let's get into the bulk of it, of what is our responsibility as a church here. So I'll let you actually start. What is it that we are actually looking at and supposed to be doing here?
So some background first before I even get into that. So when I had reached out, at least my initial thoughts when everything kind of played out with the election, I wasn't surprised. I was not shocked. It gave me more of a resolve than anything. I think from my time spent on Twitter over the past like 2 years, kind of watching a lot of this rhetoric kind of boil up, just interactions with a lot of different people in that space. When we got to this point, it wasn't a surprise. So I think for me, I didn't need to go into the lament stage, and that doesn't make me better than anyone else. It just said to me that I knew already what we needed to do, um, as a people, as a church, and that's kind of where my mind has been. I think for me, I had some frustrations because while I respect everyone's right to grief, they should. Lament is important. Biblically, lament is often how God is able to do His work in people's lives. People have got to demonstrate that their condition sucks, where they're at sucks, in order for God to do things in their lives. Sometimes I understood all that. But speaking as somebody that is a minority in this country, I saw this coming, and I said, "All right, what are our next steps?" And in this year of becoming more involved with new monasticism, more involved with a new monastic group, I had already begun thinking about ways in which the church would respond and how the church should already be responding. We are still in the middle of a significant deconstruction movement, and that movement has gotten some more sparks, given the results and the implications of this candidate, now that he has been elected to a second term. And so I think new monastics, some of us have already kind of been on the ball of how do we respond? What do we do? Because I think that the first thing is you already have a lot of ex evangelicals out there. You have a lot of people that are uncertain of where to go, uncertain of where their next landing step is going to be. And I said that this is a great opportunity for new monastics, particularly a new wave of new monastics, to step in and bridge those gaps. If they're
Real quick, because I don't think we've ever actually defined it on here. I want to make sure we do that. Can you define what we actually mean when we say new monasticism and new monastics?
you caught me.
So I just realized as you were talking, I was like, I don't think we've ever actually sat down and said, this is what we mean by new monasticism. Can you just give us a brief idea of what it is we're talking about? Because this isn't like you're now cutting yourself off from society and joining a monastery type of monasticism. So what is it that we're actually doing here?
So new monasticism is the funny part about new monasticism is that it's not actually new. Sometimes when you have the word new in front of a word, it seems like a separation from the old thing. So some background, like new monasticism does have some roots in monasticism, which is kind of what you just described. It is kind of that monastery life. What they do share is they share a rule of life. New monasticism is essentially an adoption of a rule of life that helps you aim at Jesus. I think that's probably the most simplistic definition I can give. It's not really well defined. It's really more marked more or less by what it does. So one of the things that they value, we value prayerful, contemplative lives. We focus a lot on hospitality. We focus a lot on engagement with the poor. We focus heavily on a communal life, and that could exist in a variety of ways. There are communities that, there may be 30 people. They don't all live together, but they come together at certain times to share things like meals. There are people, there's a community in North Carolina, for example, that they all live in a house together and they share a way of life. They share a common communal pot. They share all their resources, their money, their clothing. They share all those things. So new monasticism is really it's creative, but at the end of the day, its main goal is to help you form a life that aims at Jesus, something that people can see, if that makes sense. I'm still a person that
and that's part of what you were getting into before I scared you and interrupted you again. Is the communal living, the understanding, the concentrating on Jesus and concentrating on the world around us is what you were getting into. So go ahead and keep going now with where you were going in terms of what, like you said, it prepared you for this in a way that a lot of people aren't prepared.
So yeah.
So what is it that it actually prepared you to be ready to do?
So the thing about it, kind of going back to the ex-evangelicals for a second, is that you had so many that had kind of in recent years, particularly following the COVID period, that had stepped out of church for one reason or another, trying to find community, trying to find their way either back to Jesus or just kind of floundering in the wilderness. We had to be prepared to take on those people, because the thing about new monasticism is that new monasticism firmly believes in the church, because the church is a people, and I think new monasticism helps people get better at being church. And the thing about the West is that church is often something that people attend rather than something that they are. And I think that that's one of the really cool things about new monasticism, is that it helps prepare a people to be church. And I felt and I still feel, and I'm pretty sure there are many other individuals like me that feel the same way, that it can help get people back to church, get back to communities and spaces um, where they can have a relationship with God in a thoughtful, open spaces um, where they can wrestle. I don't think that a lot of our traditional church spaces uh, in the West really allow us to wrestle with God safely.
Well, and that's part of what we talked about at the beginning when we were defining lament as well. Is that part of the reason that we have a hard time with this is that our churches, for a large majority of our churches, don't allow us to do it. You know, the idea of being upset with God is looked at as
Yeah.
blasphemous. You know, the idea of being upset with, and unfortunately, and this is part of where we get into some of the bigger issues within cultural Christianity within the US, is that even in some cases, being upset with certain sects of government fall into that as well. It's blasphemy. Or they don't call it blasphemy, they'll call it Marxism or whatever they'll call it, but what they're saying, it's sinful to be upset is really where it gets laid out. You know, it goes into, and it seeps into a lot of other things, even the way that in some places we see honor thy father and mother taught. The idea of being upset with your parents is said it's sinful.
So
The idea of being upset with anybody that is within a certain hierarchy is equated with now you're upset with God, and so now you're a blasphemer.
so we've had instances in scripture. I always go back to Jonah for this, where it depicts people that are upset with God for one reason or another. Um, I had an experience on Threads this past week. So talking about lament, you had a lot of people that were kind of just sharing their slow process of removing themselves or stepping out of church. There was one individual in particular that was really, really going through it. Um, he really just felt like um, he couldn't do it anymore. Like he felt like he had basically kind of described his process of losing optimism about church, losing faith in his fellow Christians, um, and even just losing faith in ideology. And there was somebody, don't know the person, that kind of just came on there and was like, well, your ideology is pretty garbage. And I kind of looked at him and I was like, hey man, you had the opportunity to sit with somebody going through something, and this was the stance you took. Then you go to their page and it's all about how people need to go to church. And I'm like, this is exact. I'm like, this person is an exact example of what I'm talking about, where church is something that we attend rather than something that we become and do. You have an opportunity to sit with somebody going through something, wherever they're at. Go and sit with them and just listen. Doesn't mean you have to agree with them, but just allowing them to know that you're there and you're willing to listen to them and hear what they've got to say. You may not change their minds on things right away, but you can be there with people and be patient, help them process. It's one of the reasons why, since you last saw me, I've been working on, I've kind of been trying to figure out what my goal for my life is in terms of like, what is it I want to do? How do I want to contribute to this idea of being the church? It's one of the reasons why I want to be a spiritual director. I'm looking to get my spiritual direction certificate at some point within the next few years. I think it's going to be necessary because I realize that spiritual directors can be very helpful in times like these, where people are trying to navigate their spirituality. They're trying to navigate where they're going. Our immediate response as a church should be to meet people where they're at rather than criticizing them for falling where they've fallen. People are going to hit rocks, they're going to stumble, and it has never been, in my opinion, the position of Jesus to criticize people for stumbling. You pick them up. Maybe they did stumble of their own accord. Maybe they didn't prepare. Maybe they did put on the wrong shoes. But when are we going to decide to pick people up and walk alongside them? When someone is hurt, the going is slow. When the Good Samaritan picked that person up off the side of the road, it was slow going. They didn't just get up. The person wasn't instantly healed. They had to be put on a donkey. They had to be taken to a hotel. Sacrifices had to be made so that that person got better. Preparations had to be made. We have to have that same mindset with people. We're going to pick people up off the road, and we're going to get them to spaces of safety, and we are going to help them heal. We are going to be responsible for making sure that they heal.
And this is something that I've always found odd. And I've never even bothered with trying to make the statement to somebody because I already know it's not going to make any difference. But we're going to make it now. Is that oftentimes what we hear about why people are so upset about deconstruction and ex-evangelicalism and everything else is to say of like, well, you're blaming God for something that people did. And so why give up on the church because, you're just because people messed up. People aren't God, so you need to come back to God. But those same people are the ones that on Sunday mornings we hear about the whole thing of where they're preaching, well, the church isn't the building, it's the people. And so we are on Sunday saying, well, it's the people, not the building. But then Monday through Saturday, when we as the people are screwing up, we're saying, well, it's not the people. It's actually the God that the people are supposed to be representing. We keep shifting the goalposts in order to continue to make the person that is hurt on the side of the road the problem, rather than becoming a solution for that person's problem. And it's not even just, this is something that's not even just related to the election. We do this stuff all the time, of where we constantly, instead of using this as an opportunity to further the kingdom along, we end up becoming something that prevents somebody else from coming in.
You know what? And that fits really well. So I saw somebody that I do like and I respect them. I even missed them. I when I moved away from where they're at in church. But I saw something the other day about safer borders. And I said to myself, I said it's really weird to me that I see a lot of people that are Christians that advocate safer borders. Like, I agree that we should have safe borders. Don't get me wrong. I think it's good to have borders that are safe, but I also believe that we are called to reach people wherever they're at in the world. Is that the same as wanting a free for all at our borders? No, I think that a lot of people will try to compare it as such, but it's really interesting to me that I see a lot of people talk about that subject in particular, because you know what I notice. These are the same people that will not go into neighborhoods that are uncomfortable to them. Mm-hmm. These are the same ones. We, at best, they'll go into those neighborhoods and they'll take people up out of those neighborhoods and bring them back to their side of town. At best, we'll plant churches at the edge of those neighborhoods, mm-hmm. but not quite in those neighborhoods, because a lot of us are unwilling to be uncomfortable and to step into places that make us uncomfortable, step into the abandoned places, step into those marginalized places, and build a relationship with people. One of the communities, I believe it's in Kentucky, I think it's called Commonwealth, if I'm not mistaken. So again, they're a community of about like I think 30 or so families or something like that. Um, when they do their dinners, they I think every month or so they do these really big like kind of potluck dinners. The dinners, because you've got people that are poor in that community and you've got people that are rich. The dinners happen in at the people's houses that are not as well off. That is where the dinners happen. Um, what's really cool about those dinners is that everyone is serving everyone. It's not about just serving those that are poor. It's about everyone sharing the same table, serving each other. Because when you
Mhm.
serve each other, that's how you know you're equal. That's how you know you're on the same playing field. We don't do that. We never do that. We never get uncomfortable and step out into places that make us uncomfortable. Um, and so for me, that's why it's not surprising the results of this election because of these are the sentiments that I've been hearing about for a number of years. It's crazy to me that we have this thing called the Great Commission. And again, the Great Commission doesn't mean that we should have a free for all at our borders. No one's saying that. Um, but what some of us are saying is that we need to look at the condition of our hearts if we are more concerned about our own safety
Mhm.
rather than the um the word fell off the tip of my tongue about just the passing of the gospel um to people that may not know it. We are missing out on so much experience. We are missing out on so much heart change when we try to ally Christian principles with some of our political ones. Um, and that's why, again, for me, when this all happened, I said, I can't lament. And maybe that's a condition of my own heart. Um, I can't lament because all that has happened has been building for a long time. I think the other thing for me too is that I was telling Nathan this the other day. I want to see you coming, especially as a minority. If you have a problem with me for how I look, um, if you have problems with other people for how they look, how they dress, how they deal with life, I want to see you coming. You want to see the hazards. You want certain things to be brought to light because when things are brought to light, I know we talk about all this rhetoric that, at one time wasn't normalized. In some ways, I'm a little glad it's normalized because
Mhm.
to avoid a hazard, you have to see it. Before, it's like driving through, water and you don't know what's on the road because water is covering the surface of the road. You don't know, after a hurricane or after a flood, we don't cross certain places because the water, you can't see what's going on there. So something bad might happen. Now I can see you. For me as a minority, that's really important that I be able to see you because it means
Mhm.
it helps me navigate your, whether it's misogyny, whether it's racism, or whether it's just not having a good heart. You doing that publicly, enabling me to see it, helps me navigate where to go.
And that's where, you and I had this conversation. I had this conversation with Bluebeard. I had this conversation with Meek also. I think I may have even had this conversation with Joel even before the election. Is that the weird thing about where Misfits falls, as far as where we fall on listeners and outside friends and outside experiences and outside of even just online and everything like that, is that we are stuck right in the middle because we're seeing the violence. We're seeing why people are mourning. We are seeing the people mourning. But then we also are seeing the other groups that are celebrating. We're seeing some that have no idea why people are mourning because they're not seeing any of it. And so we're kind of just stuck in between here of what it is that is the actual response of the majority of people, because we're seeing it from every angle at the moment. And it's from people that we actually know, not just that we've kind of come across. Which is part of the reason why I think that we are one of the ones that, we're the ones that Stefon reached out to, is that we're able to actually hit this area from a couple of different angles here in a way that other people may not be able to. One of the areas that he talked about here, though, is something that I think we need to spend a little time on, because this is one of the things that we said, we've been saying this for years in the way we approach anything political, but this is also one of the things as the reason that we were told that or one of our listeners was told that we were unstable and we should be avoided, is what somebody described to me as an obsession with Philippians chapter 2. Because in Philippians 2, Paul is talking about the fact that our priority should be other people and their interests. And his reasoning for that is because it's the attitude that Christ took upon himself. And what we read as we go through is that the call that Paul is saying that we should have on our lives is that we should put other people's interests first, even if it means our own detriment. And that is a biblical principle out of Philippians 2, out of 1 Corinthians 13 through 15, out of Matthew 5 through 7, out of Matthew 25.
Out of a guy that is often platformed higher than Jesus.
Yeah. That is, it's laughed at in many ways. But that's what our call actually is to put the needs of other people first, even if it means our own detriment. So how are we actually supposed to do that is the next part of all of this. Because, like you said, we now can see it. It's out in the open. And so there's a good side of that, because like you said, now you know what's coming with people. The bad side of it is that the church is part of the reason that this became mainstream. And not because we were calling out sin, but because we allowed it to be what became our identifier. Rather than what Philippians 2 says should be our identifier, which is putting other people first, as well as a couple of other things related to specifically the ideas of lament and mourning and empathy and feeling and everything else. So we want to we've got about 10, 15 minutes left here. We want to make sure we hit this part of it and hit it well, as far as what the church's call is and related to the actual weeping and mourning going on. Because like you said, you saw this coming, you knew it was coming, so lament is not where you're at. I've been saying this for 10 years now that this was coming. So, the mourning side of what is coming is not necessarily where I'm at either. I've already kind of moved past it a little bit as well. But it does not mean that what we are saying is that those that are in mourning or those that are lamenting are in the wrong or are unhealthy here. The church's response to weeping should be, and this is what I'm going to use 2 verses. I don't know if you've got more or not for us, but here are the first 2 that we need to look at. The first one is Luke 11. We already talked Luke 10 in terms of the fact that coming alongside people means that's a slow process, which I think you're the first person I've ever heard actually kind of preach Luke 10 from that standpoint, and I love it. Oh, you did, man. You did. You can't lie. You did. The next chapter over in Luke 11 is the story of Jesus raising Lazarus, right? And in that story, there's a message sent to Jesus. Lazarus is sick. Come heal him. The disciples are like, well, obviously we're going. It's Lazarus. And Jesus says, no, we're not going. Lazarus dies. Then they go. And when they get there, you have the family that is in mourning. They're in lament. They're angry at Jesus. They're angry at the situation as a whole. They miss their brother. They're in a dark, dark place. Jesus already knows what he's going to do. This is the reason why he said we can't go right away, is this was always the plan. Lazarus is going to die. I'm going to raise him up. It's going to be this miraculous sign. But yet, even though Jesus knew that there was something better coming, he chooses to weep with them anyway. And there's a couple reasons why he does. One is because he's weeping over the fact that this is what has happened to his creation. I mean, there is a spiritual element to this as well, with Jesus especially. He creates this world that's perfect and beautiful without any death and destruction, and yet here he is, and his friends are all mourning over the fact that death is now here. But there's another part of this as well, and this is part of what Paul highlights in Philippians 2, that he weeps because is needed in the situation. That is what is in the interest of those around him. He is weeping with those that are weeping, which is what Paul again uses in Romans 12. We weep with those who weep, and we mourn with those who mourn. That is part of what we as Christians are actually called to do. Whether we are in that spot or not, the fact that other image bearers are feeling this should be enough for us to be able to empathize with them, to be able to say, we are going to stand by you and mourn with you.
Suffering in solidarity.
It's suffering in solidarity. And so this is the first part of what our response to the weeping should be. We should not be shaming people for weeping over a situation that they now find themselves in. We instead should be suffering in solidarity with them. And part of that comes from what you already talked about before, and this is the other side, is in order to actually be able to do that, you actually have to get out there and actually talk to them.
You have to allow people to name their hurt.
Yeah.
One of the things that we've done a really bad job of for a number of years has been, we've essentially told people, well, you can't have that hurt.
Mm-hmm.
You can hurt, but it can't be that thing. It cannot be this particular thing because it's too uncomfortable and it's too messy for people to deal with. But Jesus shows us very differently. And I just love these little moments of him where he just models something quietly. He doesn't even have to say anything. Did he have to get baptized? No, he didn't. But he did it, and he was modeling something. Did he have to, go along and mourn with them? He didn't, but he did it anyway, because that's where people were at. He didn't just kind of railroad over how people were feeling. He acknowledged how people were feeling. And I think that's a thing, that's one of our responses. Let us just acknowledge that people are feeling some kind of way, even if we don't necessarily think that that's the right thing. That is where people are.
Yeah.
That is what we have to deal with. Yeah, are people in situations because of their own faults? Absolutely. Does that happen? Absolutely. If you tell your child, not to touch a burning stove, and they touch a burning stove, and now their hand is burned. Yeah, hey, they did cause that. But over the next couple of days, if they're complaining that their hand is hurting, or if they got a scab, are you just going to act like it's not there, is your response to that going to be, well, you know what, sucks to suck? No, um, because this is part of that process. Lament, and I think it's one of the things that I had to slow down with, because um, I was not thrilled by some of the reactions that I had seen initially myself. Um, Lament is part of how we learn. Suffering is part of how we learn. It's how people um, move on to the next step. The next step often of doing something. I mean, if you look at the people of Nineveh, look at what they did.
Mm-hmm.
You know, their own king put on the sackcloth. Uh, Part of their repentance involved a great deal of lament. And Jonah, the guy that was sent to do something about it, was mad about it.
Mm-hmm.
He was mad that it's almost like he was mad that people were he was more or less, he wasn't so much mad they were repenting. Um he was more or less mad that God wasn't going to destroy them. And it is crazy to me the almost eerie way a lot of people in the West, they almost like start to fantasize about the destruction of people that either are in sin or that they believe to be in sin. And so I guess for me, at the end of the day, our immediate response, our response to the church should be to acknowledge where people are at, um, and to prepare for them spaces um, where they can work through that. Um, because that's the path
Mm-hmm.
to getting back to God, to getting back to a place where their spirituality can grow. And the thing about spirituality is that it's such an ugly thing. It's not this. I think oftentimes I get caught up especially as a person that wants to be a spiritual director. You think spirituality is thinking all the right things and doing all the right things. It's not. It's not that at all. And why would we think that would be different for anyone else? So again, for me, when we acknowledge where people are at, when we suffer alongside them in solidarity, I think that's the response to lament, at least in my opinion.
And there's another part of the Jonah story I think we need to hit for a second in terms of what you just said. Jonah was not upset that they repented. He probably was happy they repented, but he was not happy about the fact that God did what he said he was going to do. He wanted the destruction. He wanted to watch them burn. He wanted to see the show. And I think that there's a little bit of application here as well to the response that we are seeing from the Christians that are not in lament, but that are in celebration here as well. And just bear with me because we got to get this out there. If your response to the election of Trump is that God is finally bringing revival back on the land because this man was elected, while others of your brothers and sisters are weeping because they are now scared for what this means for them or their family or their friends, what kind of revival is it that you're actually hoping you're going to see? Because if your hope is that revival is coming through somebody that has threatened people and lied, and that has built his platform on denying the Imago Dei, what revival is it that you're actually wanting to see? I've seen a lot of responses of quoting 1 Chronicles 7, of that, look, God is about to heal the land again, without acknowledging the fact that 1 Chronicles 7 was written because the temple was being consecrated again. Revival was coming because the Spirit of God was finally welcomed back by the people in a way that it hadn't in a while, and now there was a permanent resting place. And now that same statement is being used to identify with somebody that has denied every fruit of the Spirit. And the church is celebrating him. The church that's supposed to be now the resting place of the Spirit is now celebrating the person that's causing other Christians to be in mourning. What is it that we are actually celebrating here? And this leads us into beyond just the call of what are we supposed to do as other people are weeping, or as we are weeping. There's one other aspect of the response here we need to get to, which is that once we get past mourning, because we will get past mourning, what is it that the church now is supposed to do? We've wept with those who wept. Now what is it that we are supposed to do? And the reality is that our call has not changed. So those that may have been paying attention, we released at midnight, technically Wednesday, but it would be Tuesday, midnight of election night, we released another blog. There's a reason we waited until midnight of election night to release this blog. That blog deals with what what Romans 13 actually is dealing with. And what the church's call is in relation to Romans 13. And part of the reality of Romans 13 is that Romans 13, that little section about how the church should respond to government, is not disassociated with what Paul just said in Romans 12. Romans 12 is where we get the idea of we are supposed to be transformed by the renewing of our mind to the will of Christ and not be conformed to the world. And then Paul gives a list of ways that is supposed to happen. One of those being actually mourning with those who mourn, which is the first thing to Christians that are going to say, wow, this guy's an idiot. Look at what it says in Romans 13. Well, if you're going to take Romans 13 and apply it to what the church is supposed to be doing right now, then you need to also then be able to apply Romans 12, which says we're supposed to mourn with those that are mourning right now.
Absolutely.
But beyond that, submitting to the governing authorities is a result of the transforming of our mind over here. We are supposed to allow the Spirit to transform our minds to the will of Christ, not the will of the government. And so we allow the will of Christ to transform our minds. And when he does that, we will be able to see why people are mourning and be able to mourn with them. We are going to be able to see how we best can love our neighbor and our enemy, which is the first time that you were on. And we talked about the fact that when you have that renewed mind, nobody is our enemy. Because we now see people as image bearers and neighbors. And so if somebody is going to make me their enemy, then I'm able to say, you are still my neighbor, so how can I best serve you? And what we also see in 13 is that when the one that is going to deny image bearer status to people, that our call is to stand with the image bearers still. Mourning with them when they're mourning, standing with them when they stand, feeding them when they're hungry, clothing them when they're naked. Doing all of these things because it's not about us, it is about Christ first. And then putting that attitude on us, which means that now it's about their needs, not mine. And if the church can actually do this in the midst of another presidency that is going to be identified by hatred and fear-mongering and lies, then we're going to actually be able to see a real revival happen, regardless of who's in the White House. But that starts with us doing the work now of actually letting people mourn, letting people heal, understanding why they are doing it, And for those of us that have already worked through this process, for one reason or another, we now stand in the gap and say we need to let them heal. We need to let them mourn. And we need to come alongside them in that way as well. So, Stefon, anything else you're working on at the moment?
Honestly, so I've actually been on. So I think part of that spiritual direction stuff. I don't know if I was on before or after I went to Trinity Seminary in Ambridge, Pennsylvania. I believe I forget. I think it was in June or May. To attend that spiritual direction conference. Since then, I've kind of been out. We've done a few backpacking, spiritual kind of retreats, backpacking. We did one at, I think, near the end or beginning of October to the Dolly Sods Wilderness. Just kind of starting to incorporating, these remote spaces into developing spirituality. So that has been really cool. The Appalachian Order, the new monastic community that I'm a part of, we've been starting to do a little bit more. We're still growing. We're still kind of in our infancy, but we're meeting monthly, and it's been great for me and for a lot of the gentlemen that are in that group to grow and develop. It's really fun because you've got guys, Minnesota, Texas, North Carolina, West Virginia, in this one group. We're getting ready to start doing some things for next year. But yeah, that's kind of what I've been up to, I guess, ministry wise. I know that there are some plans to start doing some things here in Wheeling. More so when the new year kind of rolls around. So I'm really excited about that. I'm kind of excited a little bit about the Ohio Valley. I'm just excited about the idea of starting to do God's work where I'm at. So that's kind of what's been going on with me and other people. And if they come on the show, I'll let them share because they have really cool perspectives too, so I don't want to ruin that for them.
Awesome. Apparently you need to just set me up with like your whole group, and we just do a giant group call at some point. But in the meantime, if you go on to the Misfits site, you can check out all of his stuff and where you can find him still on social media, because he has limited his accessibility a little bit on social media over the past since was on last. But you can find all of that on his guest portal over there, as well as any writings and stuff that he's doing, things like that. On the website also, if you go to ministrymisfits.com, you'll be able to find all of our other guests, as well as the blogs that we were talking about today, as well as the past episodes that he's done with me, all that good stuff. You can also help support the show by going to patreon.com. So it'd be patreon.com/ministrymisfits. And you can support the show there with any of the different levels from $3 all the way up to $100 a month. And you'll get access to early access to episodes, early access to blogs, backstage passes occasionally, as well as when Tamiko and I have time, you'll get access to the Bible studies as well. So in the meantime, Stefon, thanks for doing this.
Thank you.
Thanks for taking advantage of your open invitation. We will we'll have him back and actually do a full new monastic episode eventually. We keep saying this, and eventually it'll happen. But in the meantime, we will see the rest of you next week.
The Ministry Misfits podcast is a production of Ministry Misfit Media in association with Overwhelming Victory. Dr. Greg Linville and Andrew Fouts are our executive producers, and Brandon Simmons is associate producer. The Ministry Misfits theme song is written and produced by J.D. Laird and Laird Creative Agency. If you would like to get in touch with us, you can email us at ministrymisfitmedia@gmail.com or by following @ministrymisfit on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. You can also visit our website at www.ministrymisfits.com or through bio.link/Ministry Misfits. If you would like to support Ministry Misfits, you can become a patron by going to patreon.com/Ministry Misfits.